All right, so we are going to go ahead and get started with this closing panel, and I'm going to turn the microphone over to my colleague, Dr. Joanna Williams.
Thank you. Still morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here for the past day and a half. I feel like I'm honored to be able to moderate our final panel. Let me just briefly introduce myself. I'm Joanna Williams. I'm an associate professor in the Curry School of Education and Human Development. And perhaps more importantly, I've had the privilege of being involved with Youth-Nex since its founding 10 years ago. I think one of the very first search committees I was on was the one that brought Patrick Tolan here to UVA. So I'm very fortunate to have been part of the early vision of the center and to see where it's gone and grown since then. So I'm really excited. The panel that we have as our closing panel, I'm also really excited because yesterday Johari talked about a dream team of presenters for one of the panels. I feel like today they've brought out the ringers to close this session. So we've got our closers on the stage to talk about the bigger picture issues around democracy and dialogue and youth. So I'm going to briefly introduce the panelists, and then this format is a little bit different. They're not going to be doing individual presentations. Instead, I have a series of questions that we'll begin with, and then we will have plenty of time to open it up to questions from all of you, and I'll encourage you to take advantage of this group of people. So let me begin with introductions. I have confirmed with them that it is okay to use their first names as well. To my right is Derrick Alridge, Professor of Education in the Curry School and Director of the Center for Race and Public Education in the South, a center which I also have the pleasure of being affiliated with. He's also an affiliate faculty member in the Carter G. Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies. And he's an educational and intellectual historian. His work examines American education with foci in African American education and the civil rights movement. He's the author of the Educational Thought of W.E.B. Du Bois and Intellectual History, and co-editor with James Stewart and V.P. Franklin of Message in the Music, Hip-Hop History and Pedagogy. He's got some work that he's currently working on now that you can read more about in his bio online, and he does great work on a project called Teachers in the Movement, so I encourage you to look up his profile on the Youth-Nex website and on the Curry website. Next to him is somebody that you've heard from all the past day and a half, my colleague and friend Nancy Deutsch. She is the director of Youth-Nex. She's also a professor of research, statistics, and evaluation, and in applied developmental science, and is affiliated with Curry's Youth and Social Innovation program, which is one of our newer undergraduate majors. She hasn't had a chance to talk too much about her own research, but her program of research examines the socio-ecological context of adolescent development, particularly issues related to identity. She's focused on the role of after-school programs and relationships with important adults, and is especially interested in the process of adolescent learning and development as it unfolds within local environments for a better understanding about how to create settings that support youth, especially those at risk due to economic or sociocultural factors. Sitting to her right is Melody Barnes. She is co-director for policy and public affairs for the Uva Democracy Initiative, which is an interdisciplinary teaching, research, and engagement effort led by the College and Graduate School of Arts and Sciences here at UVA. She's also a professor of practice at the Miller Center and distinguished fellow at the UVA School of Law. Before joining us at UVA, Barnes was assistant to President Barack Obama and director of the White House Domestic Policy Council. She has also served as Senator Ted Kennedy's chief counsel on the Senate Judiciary Committee. And then finally, another person that you've heard about, he was introduced yesterday, is my colleague and mentor, Patrick Tolan. He is the Charles S. Robb Professor of Education and Human Development here in the Curry School and the founding director of Youth-Nex. His research focuses on randomized control trials and longitudinal studies of youth development aimed at providing methods for aiding and improving outcomes for youth. He's contributed to theory, methodology, practice, and policy aspects of prevention and positive youth development in his 35 years of work in the field. His current studies include the Compassionate Schools Project, which is a 45-school randomized control trial of a curriculum for 21st century health skills for emotional, physical, and social functioning. So please join me in welcoming my colleagues to the panel. Okay. Oh. There we all are. All right, so the overarching theme of this closing panel centers around this question: what needs to shift within practice and/or policy to center youth in our democracy? But before we go there, I think there's some other important questions that we need to start with. When we think about democracy, we can think about it in sort of a traditional kind of dictionary definition as a government in which the supreme power is vested in the people and exercised by them directly or indirectly through a system of representation. So power is vested in the people. We often uphold the US as a true democracy. However, as we all know, the longstanding realities of inequality, oppression, and disenfranchisement suggest otherwise. So my first question for the panelists is, how do we reconcile the clash of stories about a true democracy? And has America ever actually been a true democracy? Starting light.
You mind if I jump in first?
Please.
So this is a good question, and when you sent them to us, we had the questions in advance, so I should. But it's helpful, and I don't want to. I should, but I asked for them. But anyway, this is a good question, and the question started making me think about a research project that could be done. But anyway, as a former middle and high school social studies and history teacher, the question of democracy often came up with my students. And typically, my students, when they talked about democracy, they were often very much influenced by what was in textbooks, particularly the iconography in textbooks. And so when they thought about democracy, they would often think about the founders, the Declaration of Independence, and the American Constitution. And one way for us to pivot from a view of democracy that privileges kind of white men is to think about other documents and other people who engage in democracy. And what we tried to do is look back to the Iroquois Confederacy in 1722 to see that democracy goes back further than the founders, but also to look at other documents like the Emancipation Proclamation, study the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, elevate the notion of women's suffrage movement as a democratic movement, and to point to New Deal reforms, the wave of reforms to the New Deal as democratic kind of practices. But more importantly for me as a scholar who studies civil rights, to look at the civil rights movement in the 20th century as the personification of a movement towards greater democracy, and to look at something like, say, the Freedom Schools as kind of a vehicle, the Freedom Schools of Summer of '64 as a vehicle for pushing forward democracy. And I would be remiss if I did not mention that next summer we will be starting a Freedom School here in Charlottesville. And the Freedom Schools in 1964 was when a group of students from the North, primarily from the North, white and black students, went down to Mississippi to start these schools in Mississippi to educate students about citizenship and democracy. And this, according to Mary Wright Edelman, was very much a democratic kind of notion or practice. So I think just shifting away from what we typically think of and what we see as democracy to alternative views, I think will be one step in the right direction.
Yeah, so I completely concur and agree. And I would add to that, I think, one phrase that I think is interesting is the idea of the clash of stories, right? That I think we somehow have this idea that having competing or conflicting narratives is sort of threatening to our idea of a democracy, right? Or threatening to our history. We tend to, as a society, not be particularly good at or comfortable with the complexity of stories and narratives. And I think if we also try to move away from the idea that these sort of clashing stories or narratives are threatening to our narrative as a country, but are actually part of that narrative, right? And that we can use those to build our narrative forward. Both histories and people are complex. And unless we can really unpack that and understand how both things can be true, right? How we could have a Declaration of Independence that only emancipated land-owning white males, right? And we have still then continued to evolve as a democracy. And both of those things are true, and acknowledging the one doesn't threaten the other, right? That it is an opportunity to build toward a more perfect democracy. And I think particularly in the realm of education, we sometimes have trouble with that. Textbooks, right? We tend to have this sort of idealized view. And I think there is increasingly pushback on that. But I will tell a quick, because this happened this week, so people who know me know I often bring my daughter, my 7-year-old daughter, into my thinking about issues of development. And coincidentally, Monday was her 2nd grade field trip to Monticello. And she came home, and my husband and I asked her about it. And she said to me, "Mommy, they totally mind-wiped his history." And I said, "Mind-wiped? Do you mean whitewashed?" She's like, "Yes, they mind-wiped." Okay, yes. And she said, "They told us that he didn't want to own slaves." And so he said, "Oh, and really? Well, what do you think of it?" She said, "Well, but that's not true, because he didn't let them go," right? So even in a space where, and I think this gets at the difficulty we have about owning multiple truths about a person, right? That there is somehow a way in which we need to push away that which we don't want to see as true in order to hold up, right, that which we want to idealize as our history. And that we shouldn't. We should be able to discuss both of these things, right, in one, in the narrative, and use that as a way of pushing people, right, to work towards the more perfect democracy.
Let me just step in for a moment and say, for those of you who are not local to Charlottesville or from Virginia, Monticello is the home of Thomas Jefferson.
Yes.
So having moved here from the Northeast, I have come to see ways in which Thomas Jefferson gets centered all the time. And so you say Monticello, and everybody's like, "Oh, of course, we know."
Good point.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. And all 2nd graders in Charlottesville city schools go to Monticello.
Several different things here. And picking up on what Nancy and Derrick have talked about, absolutely. So we know the contradictions that sit at the founding of America and precede the founding in terms of the Declaration, the Constitution, but going back to 1619 and all that brings with it. And I think in another way, or an additional way to think about that, is the contradiction, the hypocrisy, pick your and choose your words about that, but at the same time, focusing on the fact that in many ways, our democracy is in fact operating as democracies will. Because sitting at those founding moments, all of the challenges, all of the inequity, everything that was baked into those moments is now being reflected in our body politic. And our body politic, in turn, shapes how our democracy is going to work. So our democracy is responding to democratic culture that's been built up over 200 plus years, and it has its roots in 400 plus years of history since the Englishmen and others and Europeans first came and set foot on American shores. So there's a question about democratic principles, tolerance, pluralism, rule of law, things that objectively we could step back and say, these things make sense and could serve as the architecture for a healthy, functioning, vibrant democracy. But we also have a clash of a democratic culture that has acted in ways antithetical to those principles And as a result, we're seeing the fruit of that. So then the question becomes, what can we do about it? Now, there's an issue, I think, and I've used the phraseology sometimes, of those bad things are part of the DNA of America. And I've questioned myself on that. Is it a DNA issue, or is it a bone structure issue? Because DNA can't be changed. Bone structure can be changed. You can reset bones. And the question is how we're going to respond to that. And I think part of our conversation today is how we center youth in the national, not just conversation, because I get really tired of the conversation, or just the conversation. I was at the White House when there was the Fear Summit, and I don't get me off on that tangent. So there's the action and the activity that has to take place alongside the discussion and conversation. And I think we will have a fulsome conversation, and you certainly have been doing so over the last couple of days, about how youth and young adults are part of that activism that determines whether or not we have a DNA problem or we have a bone structure problem. And other things that you all refer to that may help us believe that it's more bone structure is the idea that came with the founding of the perfectibility of America. And I use that to refer to, for example, the amendment structure. I mean, Derrick talked about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Now, alongside those legal changes and the struggle to get there are also the cultural changes, economic changes, and others that we are still struggling with. And in fact, how we're going to build upon the legal changes that take place. But the mechanism is there. The question is, what are we going to do about it, and who is going to participate in that part of the conversation? The other thing I'll say, and I'll say this specifically to your comment about Monticello, because it goes to the perfectibility, it goes to the narrative, it goes to the clash of cultures. One, I want to go back and talk to the leadership at Monticello about the tour that your daughter received. Because I know from work that I've done, and I sit on the board at Monticello, on that particular issue.
I said it to the right person.
on that particular issue. Because Monticello, like Mount Vernon and other places, have struggled with exactly what you talked about. And the reason that I joined the board at Monticello is, one, because as a Virginian, I grew up with that same description of Thomas Jefferson. I went to Thomas Jefferson High School. I received the Thomas Jefferson Book Award in history. Thomas Jefferson was deified. And one of the things that we've done at Monticello, there's the work around Sally Hemings and all the other enslaved families. There's the oral history. There's the change in the tours that exists there. There's the training of those that are giving those tours. So one of the things I'm curious about is whether or not the second graders are getting a specific tour that's very different from the other tours. And I've, not identifying myself, just gone on some of those tours. So I've heard what the tour guides are saying and watched and listened to what crowds are saying in response to them. And it is not Thomas Jefferson didn't want to have slaves. It is a very, very different thing. And that goes, I think, also to the heart of the question here. If, in fact, second graders are getting a different tour, why do we believe that we have to tell children a certain story about American founding? And I will close by saying this and telling a story as well. My husband and I don't have children, but dote on our godchildren. And my godson and his little brother visited the White House, I guess it was 2010. Robbie must have been about 12 and Ryan must have been about 7. And there are a lot of funny stories that go with that. But I took them in to meet the president. We went into the Oval Office, and Robbie, 12 years old, was standing there. Ryan is just chatting. And the president's like, man, you are not shy, are you? Robbie, on the other hand, was just staring at something on the wall. And finally, the president said, what are you looking at? What do you see? And he said, I see the Emancipation Proclamation. And he was zeroed in on that, and then had a conversation with the first African-American president standing in the Oval Office. And there is this tension between, and because we talked about it and they talked about it, the history that went with the Emancipation Proclamation and standing there and having a conversation with the president, he zeroed in on that. Kids get it. Young people get it. We don't have to lie to them. We shouldn't lie to them. And we don't have to make up stories for them as the one that your daughter was receiving. And so I think that sits at the heart of the work that we're doing, and not only to young people, but to adults, to our neighbors, to the rest of the globe. We've got to stop lying and be honest, and that is the only way I think that we can collectively move forward.
Well, I don't think I should say much, because for two things. One is, you said it much better and with more authority than I would have, as well as it's what I wrote down here in some word. I guess what I would say is something I thought about as an alternative response, which is, I'm not going to say any more about this question other than I don't know what a true democracy is. I think that's leads us down a false road to say what that is, or to believe that we have some concept that's meaningful in place when we talk about that. I think we have ideas about how we'd like our democracy to work, or what it would look like, or how it would be different. So all I'm going to say is I ask you sometime in the next weekend, find 5 minutes, and please devote 5 full minutes to this. And get away from everybody else, get away from your phone and your media, get away from your loved ones, and just spend 5 minutes saying to yourself, what would a true democracy look like? And you're not allowed to use the word not. So it can't be about this wouldn't happen, that wouldn't happen. And just please do that, and then carry that forward.
Thank you. So we started bringing young people into the conversation, as we've been doing for the past day and a half, in some of the responses that you heard from the moderators. But I want to be a little bit more intentional. So whether we're talking about kind of founding principles of democracy or democratic culture, if you could share with us your thoughts on how we have failed to live up to ideals of democracy, especially with youth, or have we? So there's an assumption built into my first question. So do you believe that we failed to live up to the ideals of democracy, democratic principles and/or culture with youth? So start there, and then of course we'll follow up to talk about envisioning future and possibility. And anybody can jump in who would like to start.
How about we start this end this time?
Go for it, Patrick.
So again, I'm going to quibble with you about the question. I don't want to answer about how we failed, because we've actually listed that numerous times this week, the last 2 days, and we will continue to do it. And that's valuable work. But I want to talk about it, maybe how could we do better in terms of particularly related to youth. Because I think that, otherwise we failed all groups, because even groups that are privileged are failed in an unjust society. And even though that sounds like it doesn't deserve any empathy, that is the case. So I think how could we do better? I think we might want to be thinking about some fundamental generational questions, one of which I think is, what do we do about changing some of the legal structures that we have, such as electoral college? How do we think about, for example, wouldn't we do better if we had a most popular president than one that represented 50 states? What if how can we change the way people access health care and the quality of health care distribution related to your position in society? What if we repealed the Second Amendment? What if we were able to create a situation in which we got young people to vote more? Young people vote at a lower rate than almost any other age group. And in fact, almost any politician will tell you that if you could motivate the youth vote, you could completely change the makeup of most of the city councils, senates, and who's in the Oval Office. So I think those are some of the things I think about. They aren't, they're things that I think are big questions, and I call them generational questions. I think they'll take a generation to change, but I think they may very well be ways in which we could serve youth best.
Some of the things I think about, and we've talked about, and I've heard expressed, the idea of equity. And when I think about equity, I think about a number of things, including how the table is set. So it isn't just, we've got a place here for you, you come sit here. It is starting out by who collectively is going to determine who sits at that table. And I think one of the things that it's important for us to consider is how young people and young adults are included at those tables, particularly when we think about democracy, and in a constitutional republic, part of it is you have to consent to be governed. So having young people and young adults at tables where they are engaging in many of the issues that Patrick was just talking about, and obviously, namely, big decisions that are about their future, is an important way that we can not only model democracy and democratic culture, but also that we can make better decisions about the kind of work that we're going to do. I can talk more about this as we continue our conversation, but some of the work that I started when we were in the White House, but continued, we intentionally created an outside structure, knowing governments change, not knowing just how much it would change, but knowing the governments change, focusing on opportunity youth. And are most of you familiar with that term or use that term? I see heads shaking no and some yes. So previously, there was language around at-risk youth or disconnected youth. And in concert with young people who would fall in that category, 16 to 24 years old, disconnected from education and employment, and young people who had been engaged in the juvenile justice system or engaged, aged out of foster care, or, kind of, you can imagine a range of circumstances. We started talking about not only the set of issues that were facing them and how to build pathways to reconnect to education, on through post-secondary education, on to a family wage-sustaining job. And in doing that, one of the first things we did in concert with them was start to change the narrative. It's like, I'm not disconnected. I'm not at risk. Why are you defining me in deficit terms? And hence, from them and with them, the phraseology and the narrative around opportunity youth. Because as they said to us, I see opportunity for myself. I see a world in which I want to be engaged, and I want to be, I am a participant, and I want to have a family, and I want to have a voice, and those are the kinds of opportunities that I want for myself and my peers. So let's start to change that narrative. And in addition to doing that, also working with collaboratives, now a network of communities, urban, rural, tribal, all across the United States, working with young people who are sitting at those tables, making those decisions, actively involved in changing policy and practice and the way they are seen, and doing that, I think, as a way of modeling what should happen in democracy and trying to achieve the results that will improve not only their lives, but all of our lives.
So I'm thinking about this in part in relation to the panel just prior to ours, and thinking about how this starts with the design of schools and classrooms, right? And that this idea of democratic classrooms, the last reference I'm going to make to my daughter, but she said to me once that schools try to tame her. She said, school tries to tame me, right? And it strikes me that I don't think she's entirely wrong about that. But what does it mean to have a system where part of our goal is to sort of teach kids to sit still and quietly in a system of inequity, right? What does that mean? What are we training youth for? And our goal should not be to tame, but to harness the energy of youth in pursuit of justice, right? And so I think it starts with what are the systems and structures of our schools, and are they engendering democratic ideals and notions? And then secondly, I do think we've sold a false narrative of youth, as you were sort of alluding to, this idea of young people's immaturity. One thing that I really, and of youth not having skin in the game. So one thing that really surprised me, I had an op-ed published in Newsweek, I think last week, arguing that 16-year-olds, based on the science that we know about adolescent development, that 16-year-olds should be allowed to vote, and I truly believe that. I naively did not expect this to be a partisan issue. I don't know why I didn't, but it apparently is, as I discovered when Fox News decided to pick this up. And what I thought was particularly interesting was the narrative of young people not having skin in the game. Because I think we really do a disservice to youth when we say that they do not have a skin in the game of our democracy. I mean, that is to me a ludicrous notion, right? Young people are going to be living with the effects of our current policies far longer than any politician is. And so to me, that is a way of defining enfranchisement in our democracy, again, by things like land ownership, right? The argument that was made a lot was paying taxes, right? Holding things like that. And so when we start to define who has a right to get to participate in democracy in the ways that actually make change in politicians and in policies, we are just reifying that power structure and leaving young people out. And I do believe there is no reason that 16-year-olds do have the cognitive maturity to be able to vote. So I will leave it there.
I'd just like to extend on what my colleagues have said here and, really make the point that one of the things that we can do to help our youth is to have them think about education as a form of liberation, particularly as it pertains to history. Over the last few weeks, I've been working with a group of teachers, and we've been promoting this idea of teachers learning to teach their students the concept of critical history, which is the idea of going beneath the surface to look and to interrogate our kind of traditional narratives of what we see as history, and to offer counter-narratives to that history. And as part of that, we've also encouraged them to adopt this concept of living history. So for the most part, students see, or youth see history as something that's taking place outside of them, something that took place in the past with no influence on what's taking place in the present, or no implications for what can happen in the future. So I think that if we push this idea of critical history and for them to look beneath the surface to challenge more traditional narratives, that might be one way we can help them. And I've been thinking about this term that we've been using late, I think of the last 4 or 5 years, this term difficult and hard history. A few students have asked me, youth have asked me, what is difficult or hard history? And I've had I have some concerns about using that term, because in many ways what the term does is marginalizes the history that the students should really know, that youth should really know. So I think we want to encourage students or youth to engage in a more substantive, critical analysis of history if we want to get them further along the road to looking at what democracy truly is.
Thank you. So over the past day and a half, we've heard several of our panelists reflect on questions around the role of dialogue in democracy. So I want to give each of you an opportunity to kind of add your perspective in terms of this question. So what do you see as the role of dialogue and or civility in the current era? And then to extend it by thinking about and sharing with us, what do you think are some of the important topics of conversation when it comes to youth development for democracy? We just heard from Nancy about thinking about the right to vote as one example of that. We've heard about the language that we use when we're describing youth and those sorts of things. So, Patrick first.
One thing I think is encouraging about that I've heard over the last 2 days in a way that seems to be recognizing this is a very homogeneous group in terms of values, and then probably a particularly more liberal group than would be represented in our whole society. But that said, I still think this idea that discussion and debate are essential American ideas, if what we're thinking about and what we want our society to be like. I think that has a new currency, a resurging currency that it hasn't had probably for 25, 30 years, and particularly in education, which, by the way, I wouldn't assume is Monticello's decision for the kids to hear that. It might be the schools, because I had the same experience you've had when I've been at Monticello recently. So anyway, but back to the main point. I think this idea of education being about being able to figure things out and to learn and to be able to work with difference is more vital now than it's ever been, and it's closer to a real value that we want in our schools. And I think that's a very positive thing. So I think that idea of dialogue. And then one last comment. I'll go back to the first thing. I got stuck on this concept of dialogue, because I think that's fundamentally misdirecting too. We're not engaged in a dialogue. We're engaged in a Tolan dinner where there's 8 different conversations going on with lots of people with lots of opinions, some of whom are listening to each other, some who aren't. And you got to kind of keep trying to track it and participate, because that's really what we're engaged in, or that's closer, I think, to what we're engaged in than a back and forth. I think it's the difference between imagining you're playing checkers and being engaged in 3D chess. And I think we're engaged in 3D chess.
I completely agree with you about the importance of engaging and having this multiplicity of conversations underway. When I was thinking about the question, I was led to reflect on some recent sessions that we've had, and the we in this instance is the Democracy Initiative. So we're fairly new, and we've started doing some student listening sessions. One last night, one last week. And one of the things that kept coming up among students is the fact that they find it difficult to have a conversation, one where people are actually listening as opposed to trying to prove themselves right. I'm right, you're wrong. And 2, if they have a different point of view, that there's a sense that raising it will provoke a backlash, and that there isn't a space for that exchange of differences of opinion. And that includes not only their peers, but their professors. And in fact, some students have dropped classes because it's not worth it. And I just use that as a point of entry. It stuck with me because I think these places, and that trickles all the way down to K-12 education, are such important places to sit with difference, to have respectful dialogue, but sometimes that means uncomfortable dialogue. And I say that as someone, I'm human as the next person. There are times when someone's saying something and you feel immediately, you kind of feel attacked. In your head, there's kind of this, like, what's going on? And this moment of real discomfort, and maybe you all are just better than I am, but learning to sit through that and actually hear what other people are saying, and maybe at the end of it, you still disagree. Or maybe your mind has been changed a little bit, or maybe you've changed someone else's perspective, or maybe you just learned something. But developing that skill and that muscle is, I think, absolutely critical to democracy. It is one of the things, and we read about it, talk about it all the time, that I think has been lost or not necessarily lost, I don't know that we ever had it, but certainly exacerbated with social media. And trying to find places where we can build on those muscles and build on and develop a skill set where we can be uncomfortable, but not necessarily see the other person as our enemy, but see them as just as a person with whom we disagree. And in a democracy where there's a marketplace of ideas, that they can all be out there, and part of what we're trying to do, working to create institutions that allow for it, is to persuade people of what we believe is the right direction for our country. So I think for not only young people, but for adults, to understand and to be able to do that, and for all of us to model that with one another is really critical to democracy. And it's not just youth development, it's person development.
Yeah, I think that that this idea of being able to sit with discomfort, I think, is really important. And for adults who work with youth, that's our responsibility, right? Like, we have to learn how to be uncomfortable, because we can't lead youth in that work if we're not willing to sit with that discomfort too. And so I think that's really important. I also think there is a difference between, and this was brought up in one of the panels yesterday, that debate, dialogue, difference, discussion, disagreement is all important and all part of that. That does not mean there aren't lines, right? So for me, dehumanizing, and this was a phrase that was used yesterday, right? That's where the line is, right? So knowing that that saying that we should be okay with discomfort doesn't mean that we need to be okay with being dehumanized by someone, and that's different, right? And that knowing where those lines are, and understanding, like, no, I do need to be uncomfortable. And there's a difference between being dehumanized and being uncomfortable.
That crosses the respectful line.
Exactly. Crosses the respect line. And then I think from a youth development perspective, understanding where young people are developmentally. So this is something Johari's been working on a lot, is thinking about, that having these kinds of conversations, with second graders, right, is different than having it with eighth graders, is different than having it with seniors in high school. And having a deep understanding of where a young person is developmentally, to be able to engage them in a way that meets them there, right? And that also means, as you mentioned, the adults having developed those skills. I think the idea of thinking about adult social-emotional learning is really important for this, because it does take an ability to be it takes a set of self-awareness and social awareness skills on the part of the adult to be able to engage young people in a way that's meaningful and healthy.
I would like to encourage a dialogue between generations. I think that's what's been largely missing. In our Teachers in the Movement project, we put teachers who taught between the years 1950 and 1980 in conversation with teachers who are teaching now, and in conversation with students, youth in the schools now. And it has been enlightening to hear them talk about the teachers from the 50s through the 80s who taught between the 50s and the 80s, talk about their experiences, their challenges, their quest for social justice, and to hear them talk about what they see as the differences in their struggles with what you might have today. So I think that's kind of a missing area that we can really explore.
Thank you. So I have one final question that I'm going to save for a few minutes. I want to give all of you an opportunity to take advantage of the perspectives of our panel. So I'm going to open it to questions from the audience. I'll come back to my last question, and you can all sort of share your closing thoughts in a few minutes. So if you have a question for our panelists, please raise your hand, and someone will come around with a microphone.
It's over there.
Thank you. I'm Gloria Rockhold. I work with Albemarle County Schools. And I guess my question is, where's the responsibility of the school system to model democracy? You know, we talk about the student council like in high school, and then when you go and look at or you ask, how are these students chosen? Well, the AP class teacher chose a candidate, and then I would go and talk to the Latinx group, and I'm like, do you guys have any idea that this is happening in your school? How is transparency of information not given a space in order for there to be a modeling of democracy? And then we're expecting them to get to 18, and we want them to fully engage as a civic, it's like civically minded individual that will be smart enough to be able to vote. Do you know what I'm saying? But in high school, I mean, I understand in elementary school, maybe, but I still wonder, where is the responsibility of the school system to begin modeling that transparency of information where we assume everyone is equal and representation of voice is important, and the composition of the school leadership? I mean, I look at it and I'm like, really? Who's not sitting at the table? And how is it that we allow that to happen? So I don't even know if that's a question. I think it's a question, but I just get so excited. I'm just Latinx excited, so forgive me. So here we go.
I think it's a great question. I think there is a question in there, Gloria. It is, what is the role of the school systems? And I think, I think there is a role. I think there is an important role, right? So I think, for one, I would say that same. So I'm someone who's been very politically engaged and active since I was a child. I had no interest in student government in high school because I didn't see that as political. It was like, well, that's not it, right? There were other ways that I was engaged. But also PTOs often reflect that same, right, the same power structure you're talking about in the schools in terms of the demographics of who's, in PTOs. So I think in terms of reflecting, yes, I think it's important that schools do a better job of sort of modeling that and training that. In the out-of-school world, there is an increasing movement towards the youth councils, right? So they're, the nothing for us without us, nothing about us without us, thank you, nothing about us without us, right? So there is a movement towards youth councils and after-school programs, right? And bringing young people to the table of governing programs. And I don't think there's any reason why school systems can't start doing that too, right? Make student council not about prom and, make it about actually working with the administrators to run the school. I think that could be a great, like there is, the city of Charlottesville has a Charlottesville Youth Council, right? So I think there are models that could be used to help schools move in that direction.
I would just add to that, I absolutely agree with that. I think two things. One, there's a narrative issue. I mentioned this in the context of Opportunity Youth, but a narrative shift that needs to take place not only with youth and also for Opportunity Youth, and that this is about full participation. Because people have had challenging circumstances or challenging backgrounds doesn't mean that they don't have everything to give and can be the best of those who sit on the student council, for example. The list goes on. And in fact, there are a group of young people that we worked with who formed a council of young leaders. And they put out a statement, this was 10 years ago, as young youth and young adults, about how they wanted to be engaged, the principles that they set out for their engagement in their society, in their community. And it is one of the most impactful things that I've ever read. I think most people who have the point of view that you're describing would be stunned that these are young people who are so fully committed to social activism, political activism, love, community, responsibility, accountability, all of the things that they talked about. But that's got to be part of a narrative change that takes place. I also think part and parcel with that there are good models from different places, as Nancy was mentioning, that can be used. So I think about, I don't know if anyone here is from Tennessee, but I think about Alignment Nashville. low graduation rate. What are we going to do about it? Cross-sector collaboration to do that work. And some of what happened, the mayor created a council that was focused on truancy, and there were young people that sat on that council. A young person was one of the 3 co-chairs that led the work that was specifically focused on an aspect of that. They created a standing youth council. The list goes on and on. There are other models from places that in this case, the way I use is the work that I've done through the Aspen Youth Opportunity Youth Network, where young people have said, we're not involved, that's wrong, this is adultism, and we need to deal with it. And as a result, the adults there said, you're absolutely right. So youth activation teams have been formed. And I could go through a list of models in other places where young people are now at the table. They're meeting with funders, they're helping to organize and to create conferences, they're doing trainings, they're being paid for their time because their time matters too. So there are a lot of these different kinds of models that I think could be shown to different entities like school systems if they're open to it, to say, this is what's happening, this is how it's done, don't have to create it from scratch, figure out what works for your community, and it works.
So in addition to all those, I think maybe another model that could be spurred on more, and I believe, Joanna, you are involved in this in Albemarle schools. The Dialogue on Race is youth-led, right? Some of it?
So that was an initiative in Charlottesville City Schools. It did not come from the school division. So there was an outside, it was kind of like an after school, we will do this in our spare time, allow youth to facilitate conversations.
So that's actually a lovely story of the political struggle there. But a nice example, not a lovely story, that's not the right way to say it. But, and in Chicago, there's this group called Chicago United, I believe is the name of it, which is a youth-led social change organization, as well as youth govern. And they're very engaged, not in getting at the table, but of inviting other people to the table and changing the conversation and helping direct the conversation. And there's a group in Boston, we had them here one year, I can't remember their name, but they do the same thing where they use community-based action research. The youth go out, they're particularly trying to change the relationship with police, so they're engaging in keeping track of the police, but also providing objective information about what occurs. But they also are engaged in organizing and bringing adults to the table around that conversation. So I think that is an additional strategy for how we might start to promote this idea of democracy and engagement.
Yeah. That's the teen empowerment program. Yesterday we had the Rochester branch here on one of our
great.
panels.
Thanks. Yeah.
There's another question here up front from Karen.
Thank you. I'm Karen Waters-Wicks. I'm with Albemarle County Public Schools, as well as Piedmont Virginia Community College. Patrick, I think you might have been thinking about our anti-racism policy, which has been recently adopted by the school board. That was led by young people.
Oh, great.
With Dr. Hairston.
But
Right there.
and Joanna. But anyway, my question is, what are we doing in terms of our teacher preparation, and what ideas you all have in terms of, I've got one of my students here from Piedmont who's a teacher in training. How can we develop teachers who are more willing to create space for youth voice and democracy?
I'm sorry, didn't you just say you're doing that?
I'm trying.
So how are you doing
But
it,
going
Karen?
further in their education after, if they're lucky enough to have me as a professor. However, as they go further on, what can we do to institutionalize this as a goal? I heard the question asked earlier, there's so much pressure on teachers. How do we motivate them to find the time and space to engage in this way? And of course, this conference is a wonderful example, but in terms of institutionalizing it as part of their teacher education going forward, I wonder what your ideas are.
Well, we have at the University of Virginia, in the Curry School, we have a teacher's professional development opportunity every summer that's sponsored by the Teachers in the Movement Project, as well as an initiative that's within Youth-Nex and the Center for Race and Public Education in South called Educating for Democracy. And each year we sponsor up to 30 different teachers that receive instruction in teaching, integrating African American history into their curriculum, and also using culturally relevant pedagogy. And what makes this professional development opportunity a little different than others is that we actually pay teachers to come to it. And it's a week-long program. So this year it's going to be held on June 22nd, I think, the week of June 22nd. So if you are aware of any teachers who are interested in getting 30 hours of professional development as well as getting a stipend for participating in the project, please send them forward. And Professor Jahari Harris is developing the curriculum that that we're using in that program, that project.
One thing that I think is also important, so I know, that Joanna actually teaches adolescent development to pre-service teachers, right? I think teachers need to have developmental background. I think that helps think about how to shape a classroom. The other thing that I think is really important that's been talked about a lot, and actually the prior panel touched on this, was the fact that, and I think it was brought up yesterday also, is that there's, the pedagogy, there's the developmental knowledge, but also the understanding that the teacher-student relationship in the climate of the classroom is, the necessary, it's the foundation, right? And so I think the point about how some of this work can land really badly, right? So I know there's a teacher educator, someone's like, no simulations in the classroom because we see them go so badly, right? And that's in part often because they're being put in spaces where it's not, there isn't that shared. So I think there's also something about teacher training that really does have to be starting from that base. And then I think we also have to remember that there are, sometimes we feel like if the job is too much, we're not going to take it on, right? And I think you can also think about the small ways that things get enacted, right? So I had a creative writing teacher in high school who had us do a social action research project. And we got to choose, like Mikva Challenge was saying, we chose the issue, we researched it, and we committed to an action we were going to take. And to this day, let's just say it's been at least 30 years since I made this promise, okay? I have not purchased a traditional women's magazine because of the project I did on how women were depicted in advertising in those magazines and the ways in which ads were used in those, that we paid money to buy magazines that were then trying to get us to feel bad about ourselves and spend money to make ourselves feel better. And that had a real, it was a social action, civic engagement. It was in a creative writing class, but she just thought it was important for us to do that. And again, this was brought up earlier. She didn't have she didn't have an assessment she had to give us at the end of the year. It was an elective class. But I think there are lots of ways that we can work with teachers in teacher training to think creatively about how to push in pieces of the kind of work we're talking about into curriculum and into planning. So
we've been struggling with this. We've literally 4 of us up here have had this conversation at least twice in the last 2 or 3 years, which is what if we tried to get Curry to be a school that its focus in teacher training was on social justice, that we thought that was the fundamental stamp we would put on our students. I personally have not done a whole lot to try and make that happen. I don't speak for my colleagues, I'm just confessing. But I think that's kind of if you want to talk about an issue. I'll go off on a tangent a bit, which is actually very central, but seems like a tangent. Which, if you look at what is the difference between our schools and schools where students perform better, so if that traditional standard is important to you, or they find themselves more engaged in school, or if you care about teachers, that teachers enjoy their job more and stay in the profession longer, there's 2 things that are different. One is that they don't fund schools by local taxes, so you have this built-in inequity that pretty much overcomes any kinds of reforms that we might try to do otherwise. And then secondly, they pay them much more. So it's actually competitive to get into an education school. Education schools tend to be the least competitive, and teachers tend to get paid the lowest for the degree they have of almost any profession. So those kinds of things could, in many ways, I think, be things that are driving what we see as a problem, which is teachers are not promoting democracy as much as we'd like.
Right. Let's see if we can get some more questions. I thought I saw a hand all the way in the back. Do you see? Yes.
Hi, Lizette D'Souza. I have a question that's maybe more related to the idea of morality as a third rail. So for me, when I think we've kind of been operating under this idea of, you know, if we help youth to go through this process of moral reasoning, then social justice and democracy that might take these different forms like Dr. Jagers talked about earlier. But whenever I think about morality and youth, I always approach that with some concern, because we can think about how historically, you know, we as a society have made judgments about the morality of young mothers, queer youth, who have been involved in the criminal justice system. And you know, while I'm really familiar with the idea of opportunity youth and how we're doing new things now to bring young people to the table, there are still these large groups of youth who are victimized by the idea of morality, and that's still, you know, as a country maybe we've shifted our values around that, but that kind of still colors policies that we have today. You know, someone had mentioned that you can be fired for being gay in Virginia. And, you know, I don't know if that's still a reasonable concern. So I guess that's my question. Is our focus on the idea of morality and moral reasoning?
Yeah.
Are there problems that can come along with that? Is that still a reasonable concern? If not, can you help me be more optimistic? So yes, thank you.
So I'll jump in quickly because I think it is a reasonable concern. I think it's an important one. And I will tell you, we chose that theme very purposefully and somewhat in defiance of the way in which morality has been, I would say, weaponized in particular ways, right? So to me, when I think of, you know, I think that one of the things that I have loved in watching young people move, for example, the climate issue forward, is the way they have positioned it as a moral issue, right? So, and I think one of the reasons that we wanted to center the idea of moral reasoning is because it carries this fear. It carries this weight of the way in which it has been used, around particular ideology. And in fact, I think when I think about it, I think I want to push it towards thinking much more about the general notion of respect and how we care for each other, a morality of care, right? So I'll stop there, but I think that, so that is why this was purposely pushed, and it was done very purposefully with exactly what you're saying in mind, with the idea that I think I've been concerned as a developmental scientist in the ways in which sometimes moral development or character development can slide into, right, that area of a particular form of morality or character, which is not where, and so I think we wanted to, and Johari, if you want to add anything in this too, but I think we wanted to reclaim some of that space, right?
Yeah, I would say too, that's kind of what we were thinking about, and even when we talked about this project, as soon as we said morals, people would be like, especially teachers understand it, be like, I don't want to touch that. But I think for us it was really important to ground, there's a difference between these like morals and character values and then the like moral reasoning developmental science that every single individual is going through, and it's how do we build on these like youth capacities. So that's definitely a point we talk about, and so how do we have these conversations in these spaces where morality continues to be this third rail, but the reality is how we treat each other, social justice is a moral issue, like regardless of if we don't want to use that term or we want to use a different term, it still remains like what we owe to each other is a reflection of how we value each other as human beings.
So how can we interrupt that other narrative around morality?
And that's
For
something like and I was having a conversation about somebody, it's like, this sounds terrible, it's like, maybe not everybody can get on the bus. In the sense that's like, sometimes I feel like because we are so afraid of getting in trouble, we don't do it. And who is really being victimized by our protecting ourselves? And so I think at some point we do have to take those risks. And if we look across history, across the historical processes, the justice that has been created hasn't been by the people who have not resisted. It's been by, it hasn't been by the people who have stayed comfortable. It's by the people who resisted these kind of problematic notions of what is fair and what is right. So yeah, I think it's really, it sounds simple, but it's just kind of like doing the work, even if it's, and so my husband was on the panel yesterday, and he's a teacher, so we have this conversation, because it is real, like you can lose your job. Like, I don't want to take away from the kind of practical implications of this work, but again, I think it gets to a point about what's at stake and how much are we willing to lose.
So,
I'd rather you have time here than me.
well, this is an interesting question, dialogue, and I hope what I'm saying is relevant to it, that as I think about the back and forth, the exchange I just heard, and thinking about this backdrop of democracy that we're also talking about on this panel, that I think about one of the early philosophical perspectives or views or founding ideas around democracy, which is, in a constitutional republic, which is the idea of civic virtue. And that concept being one of, what is the health and well-being and security of all of those in the community, and requiring a level of restraint on the part of unenlightened self-interest to care about all of those with whom we are in community with. Now, obviously, community was defined like this size, and we are working to expand that. But as I think about and hear what you all are talking about, it seems to me that foundational to this conversation about democracy is a question about what does that mean in the 21st century, and how do we think about the well-being of all involved, which seems connected to this conversation about moral development and well-being, and how do we establish that and center that in a conversation about youth development as well. So that's just what struck me as I was listening to what you all were saying.
So what I was going to add is moral development as a research area has really been fundamentally stagnant for about 25 years, 30 years, 40 years, I guess. Sorry, I'm forgetting how old I am. So you may not have noticed this, but this is sort of calling out the science part of this meeting. But people started with reference to Piaget, and they started with reference to Kohlberg. And Larry Nucci, who spent his career trying to see whether or not Kohlberg was correct, declared probably I've heard him say at least 3 or 4 times over the last 15 years, Kohlberg was wrong. And there is no stages of moral development. By the way, as you all may know, Carol Gilligan did a very good critique of the male-centric kind of thinking that went into that. But the point of that is that we really are not providing you all who are in the action world a scientifically based approach. And I think part of what you're raising is that maybe, and what I think Nancy and Johari are trying to, maybe we should be focusing our research more on how does moral reasoning occur? What is moral reasoning, and how does that work? And how do you promote moral reasoning that promotes certain values? Because you can't have moral reasoning without saying there are certain ways of thinking that are better, values that are better than others, and to promote those, rather than, which we all do when we start our adolescence class, and we get to moral development, what do? You trot out Piaget and Kohlberg, which are fundamentally are just wrong.
Joanna doesn't, apparently.
Joanna, good. Well, there you go. Change is occurring. So I guess the long version of that, a short version of what I just said is that I think maybe that piece of, if we could really dig into more in our adolescents, how we help them reason about moral issues, and how do they do that, and how do they developmentally capable to do it. I think that might be a place where we could start to provide a scientific basis for the shift you're talking about.
I want to encourage people to connect to with our Camp Common Ground. So they're doing some of that work too.
Yeah.
Do you want to add one last
I
comment?
was just going to add really quickly, I do think, and this was mentioned yesterday when somebody asked about the disconnect between critical consciousness work and the moral development work, but I do think you can look somewhat to the critical consciousness work as, in some ways, that even though maybe they haven't spoken to each other, I do in some ways see it as the next evolution of it, because it's thinking about how do you develop, critical social analysis of systems and structures, which is, I think, in some ways, very important for contemporary moral development. So I don't think I think they need to be.
I think it would be making that a primary focus for research.
Yeah.
I would argue for that, as well as I think it probably is most useful for the goals of this conference,
Yeah.
which is to how do we think about that as a way of promoting democracy in the next generation.
Yeah, and I think there's a great generation of scholars doing that work now, and
I just
coming
sweepingly
out.
dismissed lots and lots of important work.
No.
But I think I wanted to make my point, my fundamental point.
No, but I think they have been. They haven't been necessarily like they. I don't think that. I don't think that people do think of that work as being the continuation of moral development work. I think they are considered separately. So I think you're right.
I think they bind us to,
Yeah.
Enough of this.
So as we were planning for this panel, we were together having a discussion about the visions of the co-chairs of the conference for this. And Johari Harris made the comment that I believe we can have a true democracy, and it's the youth that will take us there. So I'd love for each of you to reflect on that a little bit. And it picks up on, Melody, something that you were just saying about re-envisioning democracy kind of in the 21st century. So if you could each just take a moment to share kind of your closing thoughts on how we should be re-envisioning a more inclusive democracy, and how you see us supporting youth in getting us there.
Are you going to go for it? Jump in.
Sure. I'll reflect on something I said earlier. Hopefully, we can encourage our youth to look at previous social movements, such as the civil rights movement, and to see the influence that it has on contemporary movements, such as Black Lives Matter. And we need to put them in conversation with one another and encourage them to learn from previous social movements for democracy, such as the civil rights movement.
So I think that one thing we do need to do, and one of the reasons that this panel is the way it is, with Derrick, who's the director of the Center for Race and Public Education in the South, Melody, who's the director of the Uva Democracy Initiative, and Patrick and I, who have been directors of Youth-Nex, is because I see real cross-sector, cross-disciplinary, and when I say cross-sector, I also mean practice and research, right? I see that collaboration as necessary to this, right? That this isn't, I think we've traditionally, studies of democracy have maybe been in political science, and then the youth development people are over here, and then the historians are over here, and I think we all have to be working together and with teachers, educators, out-of-school time programs together to do that work. And I think we should work to enfranchise 16-year-olds.
Well, I think, picking up on Derrick's point, that our history is replete with examples of young people leading change. And, love them or hate them, no matter how you feel about it, up to and including the founders. I mean, Madison in 1776 was 18 years old. Alexander Hamilton was 21 years old. I think about the story of Barbara Johns, and those of you who know her story, and leading change in Farmville, Virginia at 16 years old, that ultimately became part of the case, Brown versus Board of Education. She led the strike out of her high school. And the list goes on and on and on and on and on. So we know that young people have and will continue to play an important role in democracy and democratic change. The question is, how do we create an environment where that's easier for them to do and where their voices are more actively heard? I mean, there's a report that the organization I chair at Aspen put out a couple of years ago called Listening to All Voices. And it talks about this continuum from participatory engagement to youth and young adult-led change and the things that we have to do along the way. All that to say, there are good examples out there. We don't need to create everything from whole cloth. We don't have to discover fire in the wheel over and over and over again. That in fact, we can build on some of those models so that we can get to where we're going faster and create the kind of democracy that I think everyone in this room believes that is necessary.
I was just going to say, we should be trying to create as much as we can registries and lists and stories about where change has been successful, both the nitty-gritty of it as well as here's examples that you can follow, and try to accumulate those more so youth have models from which to work as well as we have models from which to try and draw lessons.
So please join me in thanking our panelists for sharing their perspectives. And we're going to keep this energy going. I know we've got another youth artistic presentation coming up next as we begin to close out the day today. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Harris.